So I was just beginning to watch this Lex Fridman podcast that definitely caught my attention, and I think has a lot to do with the work we're doing at InfraNodus. And so I brought this text into InfraNodus, and at first I was silly because I was trying to download and transcribe the text, but then I remembered that with InfraNodus we can just drop the YouTube link right in here, which is what I did. To get this file. So I jumped in here, and I guess I wanted to take this opportunity just to really, in a raw way, just like this is my first time looking at this graph, see how much I can explore how I go about understanding this video, this interview that I think I'm gonna be really interested in. I was gonna watch it first and then make the graph, but I think I'm gonna examine the graph first and see how that can prepare me, or see how well I can understand the video before I even watch it, and then maybe I'll do something afterwards with the video itself. And so anyway, immediately upon seeing this, like what I am looking at is just the largest nodes, and so I see obviously language and word thing. I see right here, which is going to just be something that I want to remove because it doesn't have anything to do with the content of the conversation, although I'm sure there's some type of interesting analysis you could do about, just seeing, like, for example, I can go into relations right here, and I can see, I can see which words are most commonly connected to right here. And I can turn this on and off. So by selecting I can see how it's connected to language, word, kind, yeah, dependency, people, verb, thing, English, hard. Many of those are the main words, which ultimately I'm going to remove anyway. So let me just, for the sake of just exploring this right now, going down this rabbit hole. So real quick, let me remove these other most influential concepts, which I was going to remove anyway, because for me, they're going to be either filler words or very just broad concepts that are obvious just upon knowing what the video is about. So I'm going to remove all of them except for So I'm curious just to see which concepts comes before. Maybe you can almost understand if is a thinking word, when does someone say it, does it have any indication of them thinking about something? I don't know. It's perhaps an interesting, completely unrelated to the content of the video, but that's kind of the nature of InfraNodus. Sometimes you want to just go down rabbit holes. So we see here that is connected to dependency, English, form, lot, hard, understand, structure, human, meaning. And so that's also a lot of the most influential terms, but anyway, that's a rabbit hole maybe I would go down just out of curiosity. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove because I just want to see the content of the video. And so here we have it. Now, typically you would start right here in the main ideas, but this new AI Insights kind of captured some of the big ideas right up front. And so we can see that the text or the transcript discusses the complexity of grammar structures in different languages, the importance of form in human language, and the challenges in understanding and producing sentences with various dependencies. And then we can see some blind spot questions, which is going to be creating questions for these blind spots right here. We can cycle through them. I should have read that. And maybe it would be interesting to go ahead and just kind of jot all these down. Questions for me to maybe think about before watching the video myself. And it's interesting just by knowing which questions are interesting to answer, even if I'm not even if I'm not educated enough in this field to be able to formulate these questions. My ability to look at these questions is really informative to the nature of the conversation, because the questions themselves encode a kind of like conceptual pairing under some type of proposition. And so just by reading the questions, I almost can elucidate a lot about what the content of the video is, or at least leads to. I can see how does the structure of language, word or verb, reflect and influence the cognitive processes in the brain, such as reasoning. And so immediately just here, I can see right away, like this is going to be pulling from some main ideas in the text. So I can see a conceptual pairing going on. So I can see, the structure of language, which is more specifically word, order, verb, object placement. And then I can see the other concept, cognitive processes in the brain, which is the main concept such as structures of the brain, and then is parsed out further with reasoning, network formation, listening skills. And what's interesting is the relational dynamic of them is influence, right? And so like that influence is connecting these two concepts. And I can now infer from that there is this force dynamic that exists, or it might exist, between the structure of language and cognitive processes, which, put it that way, I am familiar with that, and that's interesting to me to kind of see that as a question and to reflect on that, if I wasn't already aware of that, to reflect on that while watching the video. How does the variability in verb-object order across languages influence narrative movement and theory formation, considering the cognitive load involved in processing irregular versus regular grammatical structures? So here's probably a little more complex. You have variability across languages. We have the influence, relational dynamic, and then we have narrative movement. But it's then enveloping it in the considering. So this is kind of saying, given the context of this following concept, with a versus, and so another relational dynamic. So in the context of these two, in a comparison way, cognitive load and regular grammatical structures. So anyway, I'll hide this for now, put it away. So what can we do here? Well, just seeing some of the high-level ideas real quick. It's always kind of fascinating to see how InfraNodus is using the relational structure of words to kind of extract or infer meaning, semantic. So we have syntax measure, abstract communication, morpheme frequency. Is the word morpheme ever used in here? I'm assuming it has to do with morphology. Okay, so morpheme is used in here. So I'm curious about that word, because I've never heard that word specifically. So I can click that word, highlights it in the graph here, and then I can now see the statements that it's in. So I can understand. And I can click a statement, and it should highlight the entire statement in the graph to see, across the... I can figure out the morphemes, which are technically morphemes. I'm not sure if that's a word. It actually has two morphemes. So it's, I guess, two forms. Forms in morphological forms is probably what a morpheme is. The study of morphemes. Morphology is actually between morphemes. Okay. So most influential concepts. Do I want to do any more cleaning? That's kind of a good question to ask now. Something like lot is just a lot, which, now here's an interesting kind of question you have to ask yourself in cleaning is, I feel like lot is kind of this extraneous word, but at the same time, it does give some context to it. Now, actually, what I'm realizing just now is I think I have a setting on that I shouldn't have on, and I'm curious if it will change, because we had both and lot, and what that's telling me is that I have a setting that isn't the default setting on, but is a good learning experience, and that setting is, yes, what are the most influential nodes? So right now, this is not the default setting, but I was exploring before, I set this to, I want the most influential nodes to be based on the highest degree or the number of connections. Typically, it's on highest betweenness centrality. And so let's change that, and we'll see how that changes the graph. It'll probably change everything, including some of the structuring of the high-level ideas. Okay, so lot is still picked up as a big one, but the graph structure overall definitely did change the main topics when we switched from degrees of connection to highest betweenness centrality. It changed some of the clustering. So anyway, we're still gonna, I think, remove lot, even though it does give some context to the words around it, in the sense that it's being said, this is said a lot. The word lot with a lot, which is not in there, the word a is not in there, but the lot kind of, when we are deriving questions from the context of the graph, having a connection to lot may imply the degree of it, which might be important, but I'm gonna go ahead and remove it. Is there anything else I want to remove? I think all these other words, and it's funny because many of them are kind of in a meta way, we have nodes for sentence and meaning, which is a lot of what we're talking about, but are part of the most influential concepts here. And let's talk about kind of so the clustering is not always going to be clear clusters. We cluster them on by color, and you can see some of the breakdown of how the color is, but oftentimes they're meshed with one another. And so there is a relationship to like where words are in this graph, seeing the word English close to grammar, form, verb, that makes sense because there's gonna be a proximity to them. It's interesting that hard is kind of both a large node and in the center. And I think I have a feeling about how the word hard is being used and why it's in here. I mean, they're talking about something that is hard, which is interesting. I was going to say the concept of the hard problem of consciousness, which maybe I assume that they might have talked about here. But it is just interesting to see if that is not the case. They're just saying that's hard. It's hard. Kind of hard. And so maybe it is worthwhile to, at least while curious, if we remove this, we'll kind of way the graph restructured. I might put it back in. How the graph changes, reveal the high-level ideas. And it is sometimes kind of hard to know what is right to remove and what's wrong to remove. But I think I do actually like, I might put it back in later. I think I do actually like having that node in the graph because it helps to orient. I think it is interesting in the context of this video to understand what words are connected to hard. So if we put, like, for example, if we put that back in and we go, and we select hard and I look at the relations, English is hard, form is hard, structure is hard, meaning is hard, sentence hard. I don't know. I'm going to keep it in there for now. Because one thing I want to kind of do, okay, and so something that, I think oftentimes I find myself sticking to these for really quick, big picture ideas. It's kind of like the low-hanging fruit, AI insights, main ideas, blind spots. Relations definitely is interesting, but, it definitely is zooming in on things to maybe see the relationships of them. But I don't so often get to this point. And I want to start examining that more. I definitely look at it, almost all the time, but I don't really examine it very, very often. And I think there's something to learn from it. And so what we're seeing here is we can see as we hover over here, the frequency of the words that are being used as the discourse evolves over time. So that's kind of interesting to see what words pop up later. So in the beginning, a lot of talk about, what is that? English and verb, meaning. And I guess this moves to over here, we're looking at form is. So I don't know if it's just that there is kind of homogeny across. It is a pretty, see, it's a somewhat medium topically diverse, and so there is a little bit of homogeny happening in terms, but I can see, what is that right there? So this is human, is that the one that's 23, the largest one, versus structure? It's interesting. So like for here, structure is, at this point in discourse, it's mentioned a lot, whereas when we get to talking about human form, it's replacing the frequency of structure there in some way. Is it substituting for it? Is it suggesting that the structure of human form, there's a lack of structure of the human form, or a lack of importance? I don't know. Emerging keywords. So is this... Actually, this makes me want to do something. What I want to do is I want to kind of watch the timeline. So let me start at the beginning. I think these are all time-coded. All right, they are. And so I'm going to play. And so I can kind of see, if I turn the high-level ideas on. Now, this is interesting because I can kind of see the clustering of the conversation. And so, this beginning point, they're really down here in this section of the graph, talking a lot about this right here, sentence structure and verb order, Whereas up here, and it's kind of crossing over, it's kind of interesting to see where it crosses over. And to what degree, if I can fast forward this, I can go through here and I can see that maybe it starts, when does it start? It starts hitting that hard a lot. Maybe stop. I keep on going back. Let me activate it. So now I can kind of go through on my own. So it keeps on hitting that hard problem a lot. That hard word a lot. What and you can kind of, you can even see, when do they start? They're not up here very much yet in data comprehension, which would make sense because it's kind of like they're talking about the fundamentals of it. They get into it. They're talking about the fundamentals of it, and then they probably get into this computational side of things. Network hits a lot. Meaning form, meaning form, meaning form. This conversation back and forth between meaning form, meaning form, meaning form. What else can we do here? Filter. So let me deactivate. Filter. I was doing highlight, but now I want to filter. So let's see what happens. See, that's interesting too. So now you can more isolate and see the high-level ideas of each of these statements and how they shift around. It's really beautiful. Even just little tiny movements across each. And I think I can isolate this to statements, or is that only gonna? So another thing that I can do, so that's one way of maybe simplifying, kind of looking at it and seeing, and playing through the conversation by filtering the visible statements. But I think another thing I could do is go into the node filters. And I can adjust the threshold for how many degrees of connection need to be present for it to be shown. And I can reduce the graph to its most fundamental. It's interesting. Hard English. Hard is one of the most fundamental parts of this. So I want to get to a place where it's not crazy cluttered, but also not completely sparse. I want to turn off these real quick. I think somewhere around, I don't know, it's kind of subjective for me right now as I'm just exploring this. I think that's kind of nice, because I have some of these more, it's getting too much here. Let's go really, really sparse and just understand. I want something like that right there. And now at that state, can I go ahead and can I play? And I want to highlight, activate. And I can see maybe to a certain degree the really fundamental development of the conversation. And now, right now in kind of real time, it would be hard for me to parse this together real quick, but I can spend more time with this. And maybe it's not ultimately fruitful. It's a lot of, but in other if there's other goals of this analysis other than preparing for video, this might be a lot of work just to prepare for video. But if it was for something of greater value, or I could see an interesting compelling reason to really fundamentally understand the nature and broad connections. And perhaps this is too sparse. Maybe it's better. This is kind of nice, and I can turn the high-level ideas on. And I can see, and it's good to kind of see what these words are when they're not being highlighted. And then, of course, I can stop it, and perhaps, by going through it manually, you can kind of zero in on maybe a part of the conversation that you want to be interested in, especially if the conversation is more structured. Here, we're kind of it's kind of this one central idea with these subtopics, which I kind of inferred from the nature of the coloring of these clusters, that there aren't distinct colors here. I can get more of this down. What are some of the stats? So maybe at this point I would, after that kind of like initial look, let's deactivate that. Let's turn off the high level ideas. Maybe at this point I would do another run through, and I maybe want to remove hard. And maybe actually I would want to what I can do is I'll go back to the entire graph. Another way that we can reduce it is, one we can do, we can do, go into the main ideas. And so we can reduce it by continuing to reveal underlying ideas. And so we're going to continue to, as we remove these most influential concepts at each point, we're going to lift up those concepts that were, foundational to, that were underlying these most influential concepts. And one thing that I like to do would be I did a couple iterations of it, but I like to watch both the structure of the graph. I'll get rid of all this. Both the structure of the graph, and also the thematic clusterings. What are the names? It's really easy for me to quickly see the names and maybe have like a very intuitive associational understanding of it. And I like to reveal the underlying ideas iteratively until we get to like a very sparse graph, and at each level kind of see the development of like what a more granular underlying or a more fundamental underlying idea of the discourse is, looking at the ways in which the graph changes, the structure, and then also the cluster and the cluster naming. And when I'm doing this at some point, sometimes I will go ahead and I'll export CSVs of the data at each point to analyze later. So if we kind of go through this, and I'm watching like the clusters change. And sometimes, like for me, I don't always, there's not necessarily a lot of action items immediately. I think there's a lot of benefit out of just familiarizing yourself with the discourse, with just like a broad understanding, even if you can't necessarily you haven't fully connected the dots. You kind of have this you get the underlying, the big ideas. You kind of just have a feel for it. You have a feel for it. I see how it's developing over here, and maybe sometimes as I'm going through, a new formation of the cluster will pop out to me. It'll be interesting to me. I'll say, oh, maybe I'm very interested in evolutionary patterns, which wasn't there before because as you remove nodes, the nature of how the graph clusters and contextualize those clusters changes. And so maybe there was something disguising that, or there was an influential node that was included in this cluster before that changed the context of it and the presentation of the high level idea. But now I see it as evolutionary patterns. And maybe it was there before, I'm just seeing it now, but now I'm seeing it, I'm like, that's an interesting thing to look at, maybe. Or syntax optimization. So we can see how revealing the underlying ideas is going to give you kind of a zooming in a way of some of the things that were under the big ideas. So you see, we lost the evolutionary patterns, but morphological patterns came in. So, which is interesting to see both of them. At first it was evolutionary, but it's evolutionary of the morphological nature. And so generally speaking, you can see a thematic trend to each of the clusters. I haven't kept track of all of them, but I do remember that, across as we change across each iteration, cluster one, the name changes. And of course, some of that has to do with the fact that it's being sent to GPT. And so there's a degree of interpretability and how it's going to understand the context of the keywords that you just sent it, but also the actual keywords and their connections are changing as well. And so over time, so even just focusing on that first one, linguistics analysis, now is both the color of it is gone, and we've got sound difference, syntax love. Does anything pop out to me as, and still it's not that, but you can see one thing that's kind of happening earlier. This topical diversity down here was down at medium, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but you can rewind and kind of see how, as we were revealing the underlying ideas, this topical diversity is becoming more and more diverse. And so I'm going to keep on going, maybe one more time. Which is nice. I kind of hit the topical diversity max, and so maybe that's a good threshold to be like, this is a sparse graph. But I kind of in the past have done a little bit more visually. oh, it's interesting. The topical diversity dropped back down. So the reorganization of it made it less topically diverse. Reveal. I'm going to go ultimately to where I like seeing it just visually is kind of cool looking, and see what kind of topical diversity is at that point. So I like getting it to like this point right here, where it's kind of like this petri dish. And we went back to a medium topical diversity, and so maybe it'd be worthwhile to kind of go back and see what stage was it at when it was most topically diverse. But topical diversity is not necessarily like maximal topical diversity is not necessarily the best thing. Optimal conditions should be determined by what the goal is. And if you look at the ecological thinking framework, you'll see that like the diversity of topics is part of this like modulation through states. And right now I'm just kind of going through and highlighting these just to kind of get a picture of it. But at this point, I can kind of see some of these. So we're at this point where words don't really have. We have some big ones like label. Maybe there's something interesting to see that this far down. Like, what are the most influential concepts, and why would they be considered like influential at this stage of underlyingness? And it is interesting to see label because the word label itself is something, but like the implications of their use in this context is really important, because all of language is kind of a naming of things. So like fundamental and underlying everything is how we label things. And I know that they, at least in the headline of the video, they talked about the relationship to LLMs, which labeling is an important part of the like training process and to their efficacy. But fundamentally, language as a tool is a tool for labeling. We name things, and in naming them, we understand. We like name forms, and we name relationships, and those labels interact with each other. And there's meta labels for the categories of things. And so, like, even to be able to say a typical sentence structure is going to be subject, verb, object, or subject, preposition, object, whatever it is. Those are all labels for labels, because even dog eats food. Those are all representational labels of physical objects, which may sound like a oh duh, but oftentimes like insight is very simple in its profundity. So and perhaps honestly it's funny because it's not even that this discourse told me that about labeling, right? And it may not even be what is going to be discussed in this video, but the fact that like I came into this discovery process with some contextual understanding of language and a fascination with it, and have spent a lot of time thinking about it, like however it is that I got there, like that is somewhat of a an insightful moment of like, oh, the importance of labeling things, how language is just labels upon labels upon labels upon labels, turtles all the way down, right? It's symbols and images and labels and just representations. But so yeah, like it might have been in the discourse that I got there, but in the process of going through it, I have this insight, which so it's important. And that's kind of sometimes the nature of the work with InfraNodus, in a lot of cases, especially if you're just kind of doing it in a broad, research instance. And so I won't go any further now. I think that's a good stopping point, but I think I'm going to pull some more questions from the blind spots, and it's interesting to kind of do a deeper dive of each of those stages of the reduction, looking at what the blind spot questions are, looking at what the most influential words and the clustering is, developing that kind of like developmental understanding of this discourse from very many different aspects. Both like you can see understand the aspect of it driven chronologically, as we looked through the statements going through the time, because as I scroll through, that's the timing. And now, each stage you can kind of get an understanding on a couple different dimensions. So you can look at across time, how the discourse changed when it was a dense graph at each stage of the reduction of underlying ideas. But then you can also get kind of this understanding of the groundedness of the ideas. So not time oriented, but like conceptually oriented, semantically oriented. And all these cross sections of the discourse are are helpful in understanding what is going on in the discourse. And so I'll stop there, and I will perhaps spend some more of my own time going back through each level, pulling some blind spot questions, and then taking those questions in with me as I watch the video. Maybe I'll formulate some of my own answers to those blind spot questions to help me prepare, or maybe I'll have them just as note facilitating tools for me as I watch the video, help me to think about what it is to pay attention to and whatnot. So anyway, I hope that was a kind of helpful rabbit trail discovery process of both an interesting concept of language, but also kind of an exploration of how you might be able to use InfraNodus. So thanks.